Learning about video game history, and specifically computer history, is one of my favorite hobbies. My favorite period is probably the 1980s, when the United Kingdom was having their kind of microcomputer revolution, when those were getting more affordable and people were creating video games for them. I find that part just incredibly fascinating. Europe specifically is a very interesting market for video games, especially in the 1980s, when the console manufacturers were largely ignoring it. It wasn't until the early 90s, when you see like the Mega Drive and also the Super Nintendo move in, when these companies actually started to care. Before that, the home computer was really allowed to thrive, and this whole cottage industry was created, which turned into more of a professional video game industry. And Tom details a lot of this. There are some other reasons behind it from what I used to know, so it's kind of fun to see just a really deep dive on just the UK in this whole market. Sorry, I'm starting to ramble a little bit. I just really love how he details everything, especially the efforts of the British Broadcasting Corporation and how they helped to popularize computers. In some ways, it reminds me of the book Gaming the Iron Curtain by Jaroslav Svelch, and again, I'm sorry that I'm pronouncing his name wrong. Both books cover computers in Europe, but show the difference in how just opposing government ideologies can affect how computers get to the public. It's really cool, especially when you read this book and then you go back and you read Gaming the Iron Curtain. They're both very fun books, but they're fascinating when you compare them. In the first part of this book, Tom moves through the early years of computers. World War II is pointed as one of the reasons for the quick advancement of computer technology. There are several early mainframe computers that are mentioned from the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. From that point, we get to a period of rapid miniaturization, if I can talk right. Basically, taking all of those mainframe computers and shrinking them down to where they would fit into what you would see in the microcomputers, like the PET, the VIC-20, the ZX80, the ZX Spectrum, so on and so forth. There are also some pretty fun stories about microprocessors and how they eventually helped with computers. But this story has to do with just controlling the flavoring that went onto crisps or potato chips. And I just found that really funny. I don't know why. I was like, oh yeah, that's another thing that they were doing at this time. They needed machines in order to kind of help create some of the products that, maybe we shouldn't be eating, but we are anyway. Whatever. He also brings up some of the moral panics that went on around this time concerning computers and also robotics, how they were going to take people's jobs and that sort of thing. The British government, to their credit, they tried to just increase computer literacy. This led to some innovations in the computer industry, and it also really helped several very brilliant people in creating companies that would make microcomputers. I know I'm skipping over a lot, but I don't want to give just a blow-by-blow for this entire book. I find this part of history of computers and video games really fascinating because several companies would create just cheaper and cheaper computers that helped teach people how to use them. There are a lot of really cool stories here, and I would encourage you to go read the book, or just do some research on your own to find some of them. I've heard many of the stories that Tom brings up before, but it's still really cool to read his take on them and read some of the information that he found, just because I hadn't really seen it in other parts, or really haven't seen it in any other books or other videos. So it's fun to get that stuff in here as well. And Tom does a really great job of recounting how things changed and just laying everything out, like how the BBC helped to really popularize computers and how they helped to popularize learning how to code. Okay, this is my favorite part of the book. I just love this part because it has to deal with video game history, and particularly my favorite part of computer games in the UK, where you just have a bunch of people learning how to code and they're creating just new games on their computers basically in their bedrooms or in the living room, because there weren't that many TVs in households at the time. So you have these like 15 and 16-year-old kids making video games, then either selling them for almost nothing to these just startup computer companies, or creating their own companies and selling their own games. It's just so cool to read about this stuff. I love this part of computer history. So this is really just one chapter of the book, and it's a very brief history on how the whole cottage industry of computer games started in the UK. The early microcomputers were all about learning how to code, which was promoted by the BBC, also by hobbyist magazines and some trade magazines. Tom does an excellent job of explaining all of this. The 1980s was just a really interesting time, and Tom talks about how there was this economic downturn in Britain at the time, and the tech industry was starting to emerge in some parts of the country. He also recounts how some of these kids that were creating video games ended up being like another source of income for the families and whatnot. Not all of them, but just every once in a while he brings that up, and how some local newspapers were talking about it. While I like reading stories about Maniac Miner and Jet Set Willie, I found the story of Imagine to be way more interesting than those. They had a really kind of forward-thinking marketing strategy for everything, and their sales team was really good. It's a story about just... it's a story that I might want to look into later. And yeah, it's a very fun story to sit back and read and just go, oh, okay, so they built up this whole kind of house of cards and everything, and as costs started to go up, they just couldn't keep everything together, and then they started to collapse. It's a fascinating story. The relationship between video game publishers and gaming magazines is mentioned. It has been kind of a strange story since, the very beginning of the industry. Magazines want access to games early so that they can review them and write about them, but they also want the publishers of those video games to advertise with them. This gives the magazines a monetary incentive to give games a positive review, because if you want to get the company to advertise with you, you should probably say their games are pretty good, even if they are kind of shit. It's interesting to see how this issue has always been around and will probably never go away. It feels like every company wants positive reviews, but publishers don't want to wait to release a game that's actually finished, or they have their shareholders and other things that they need to worry about, so they're not totally invested in the game, if that makes any sense. They're not really worried about the quality of it. They just want to get it out so that they can see their stock prices go up or something like that. It's a very interesting situation, to put it nicely. It's not something that's very good, but it's kind of the way the industry works. He then transitions from this into some talk about piracy. And Tom makes a really great point about just the impact of piracy on the video game industry. No one knows how much money was actually lost due to piracy over the years, but it was rampant in the 1980s and 90s. If you knew the right people, you could get free copies of computer games, whether they were on just the little 3x5-inch floppy, or if you knew a kid in high school like I did, who would just burn them to a CD for you. It happened all the frickin' time. You can even go online now and find free copies of games. It's probably never going to stop, and no one actually knows what the economic impact is. So, yeah, it's kind of a weird situation. It's one of those things that's never going to stop, and it's very interesting to look at, especially in the 80s, where you could argue there were more copied versions of video games than there were actual video games sold. To wrap this one chapter up, the last thing that is really mentioned that I wanted to talk about was how the entire industry changed from that whole cottage industry in the early 80s to becoming a more professional industry in the late 80s, kind of the mid to late 80s. More money came in, and there was this expectation of professionalism and treating the industry differently. The cost was also going up on just making a game. It wasn't really up to one or two people to sit down and make a game over the course of a day anymore. You had to kind of plan more of these things out. You had to do more quality control. And people were expecting more from video games at the time. The cost and the number of people and everything, those were going up. And there was also this rapid changing as the industry started to take shape. This wasn't just in Europe, but this was kind of worldwide. On the business side of things, barriers were starting to be created for the smaller developers and also the smaller publishers regarding distribution and advertisement. Some things haven't really changed over the years now, have they? This chapter contains just so much information. I like the way that Tom explains things and how he tells these stories. And yeah, this is my favorite, really, period of video game history. Tom has done just a great job of laying all of this stuff out and really doing an excellent job of explaining how some people were really just bemoaning computers at the very beginning and how they were just being used for games and they were wasting the potential of the computer. And then he points out how the people who were making all of these games on computers were learning how to code and they were learning new skills. So you weren't really wasting the potential of computers. They were just being used in a way that, for lack of a better term, the establishment or the older people thought computers should be used. It's always nice to learn something from a book. It makes me happy to discover something new or add on to what I already did know. And I learned quite a bit from this book. It was really great. I enjoyed learning about the origins of the computer industry in the UK. I didn't know about the kit computers or the other hobbyist computers that were around prior to really when Sinclair was working on stuff. And it was just really cool to learn about those. The stories about the video game side of things, those are always fascinating to me. I really loved learning about just all the different companies that were created around this time. Like, I didn't know about Imagine before I started reading this book, and I'm really glad that I got a chance to read about it. There is a lot more to this book that I haven't talked about here. This is a great history of the UK computer industry, and Tom does an excellent job of compiling all of this stuff and putting it together in a way that is pretty easy to understand. So that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.